trauma and meeting the risen one. Dr. Greg Caron received his MDiv from the Catholic University of America. I don't know how to pronounce that. His PsyD in clinical psychology from the Virginia Consortium for Professional Psychology. He served 20 years on active duty as a Navy clinical psychologist on 2 aircraft carriers and at the combat hospital in Kandahar, Afghanistan. He currently serves at the VA Medical Center in Togut as staff psychologist on the PTSD and general mental health clinical teams. Please give him a hand. That you hold your questions and side conversations till the end. It can be distracting to have interruptions. We definitely want to have time for questions, but if you could please hold those till I give you Greg.
Thank you, Misty. And thanks to my tech team, Sharon, for setting up. It's very, very, very helpful. And it's good to see all of you this morning. Good morning. So just to note before we start, since I'm talking about trauma, you know, I may mention a type of trauma. I'm not going to go into any details about traumatic events, but I will talk about types of trauma, and it could be a trigger. And if you feel that you need to, you know, step out of the room at any point, feel free to do so. And I'll be available after the talk to answer more questions or talk. So, let's see. There, it worked. So what I'd like to do today is define and conceptualize trauma and discuss the impact of trauma, the psychological impact on the self and on community. And then I'd like to reflect on the early disciples' experience of the cross and resurrection through the lens of trauma, particularly through the theology of Shelley Rambo, who teaches out of Boston University. So it's basically her theological thought that I'll be presenting today. And it made a lot of sense to me. It helped me to understand the concept of the resurrection. Because as a scientist and as a person of the 21st century, that's hard to grapple with. And what she had to say made a lot of sense to me and helped me integrate some of my experience. Oh, that's okay. Thank you so much. So how we define trauma will influence our level of empathy. Or we can have a tendency, if we are not tuned into it, tendency to pathologize or victimize the victim. So that's why the defining of trauma is very important. To start at the foundation, I came across a text by Katha Weingarten. The title of the book is called Common Shock. And she talks about trauma as a range from boundary violations all the way to severe trauma. So let's think about trauma as a range of degree. And a boundary violation would be like someone getting in your face and yelling. Okay, here's a picture of a cook saying, I told you to use oregano and you use marjoram. Oh, you ruined my sauce. So, right. And then all the way to extreme trauma. And you know where you were on 9/11, I'm sure. It impacted us individually and as a country, as a world. So think about trauma in that range. And of course, other extreme traumas can involve the loss of a child, no matter what age, or a combat veteran, right? Extreme trauma, or sexual assault. You know, those are the extreme examples. And so Dr. Weingarten says that we are inured to common shock triggers because we're inundated with it in our lives. We have all these on the news and in our lives. We're just filled with it. And so we learn ways to kind of shield ourselves against that. We put up filters. And when we begin to put up filters, we can become insensitive or we become silent. You know, think about if you were in the supermarket and you witnessed a parent getting angry with their child and hitting their child, you would think about how you would feel physically and emotionally. That's that kind of shock. And we come across that, let's say, in our everyday life. And what do you do with that? Do you keep it to yourself? Do you intervene? Do you talk to somebody about it? All of that accumulates. There's an accumulation of that. And so she says that looking at paying attention to even the mild common shock is constructive. It may lead us to a surprising and unexpected and helpful insights into our lives if we pay attention to it. And it helps us to develop empathy and the ability to both understand another's experience and to feel what the other might feel. So paying attention to that. She also talks about with common shock, as well as the whole gamut of trauma, that we witness, when we witness these things, we can witness ourselves as witnesses. We can witness ourselves as victims of a trauma, or we can witness ourselves as a perpetrator of a trauma. And then the other person can witness themselves as a witness, and witnessing themselves as victims, and witnessing themselves as perpetrators. And she mentions two dimensions that reliably influence the quality of witnessing. Witnessing the violence or violation in isolation or with others. And is the intent malicious or accidental? You know, is it human-made or is it natural environment? All of those things will influence the impact of that trauma on you. And she shows this little chart here that levels of awareness and feelings of empowerment impact how we experience trauma. And you can see, are we empowered in the situation or are we disempowered in the situation? Are we aware or unaware of what's going on around us? All of those factors influence the quality of the trauma. So I'm going to move now to psychiatry and mental health and how they conceptualize trauma and define trauma. And those of you in mental health know what the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. And when I started my graduate work, it was DSM-3. And now we're all the way to DSM-5. And so in the DSM-3, they define trauma as an event that is outside the range of usual human experience and that would be markedly distressing to almost everyone. Okay, that was DSM-3, 1990, early 1990s, right? And then I think I'm missing that. Oh, ICD-9, that's right, ICD-9 and 10. The International Classification of Disease also defines trauma, and they define it as the early ICD-9, an extremely traumatic, usually life-threatening stressor such as military combat or a violent personal assault. The traumatic event is outside the individual's normal realm of experience and overwhelms the individual's usual psychological defense. Well, we've changed that, and part of the reason is that there was for example, one psychologist who's a feminist psychologist, I'm going to talk about her work in a second, critiqued that because those early definitions were really coming from the viewpoint of a white privileged male, right, population, and not from the point of view of women, right, or other minorities or other ethnic groups and so on. So with DSM-5, currently, the definition is exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence, and direct experience of the traumatic event, or witnessing in person the event occurring to others, or learning about the traumatic event of a friend or close family member or close friend, and experiencing the repeated or extreme exposure to aversive details of a traumatic event. Okay. So when we talk about the impact of trauma in terms of a psychiatric diagnosis such as PTSD, right? When the symptoms last more than a month, it is considered moving into a disorder because it's negatively impacting the person's quality of life. And there are 4 clusters of symptoms with PTSD. There's the symptoms of intrusion, such as nightmares or flashbacks or just intrusive memories of the trauma, or triggers in the environment where trigger intrusive memories. And then the second cluster is avoidance. You know, no one wants to be distressed, so you find ways of avoiding all the triggers, avoiding people and crowds, possibly, people, places, and things. Or you avoid thinking about it. You try to push it out of your memory, right? Avoidance. Or you can use substances. You know, alcohol is a good way of dealing with post-traumatic stress. It numbs the distress. So you can think that that's a normal human desire to avoid distress. Then a third cluster of symptoms has to do with the way the trauma impacts the way we think about ourselves and about others and about the world, and how we feel on a normal day-to-day basis. In terms of, it can really numb our emotions so that we end up not being able to feel any positive emotions. So that's that third cluster. Then the fourth cluster has more to do with physiological arousal, such as irritability or being on edge or poor sleep. Those all have something to do with the way our body is right there on the fight or flight kind of feeling constantly. So the four major clusters. ICD-11 is the more contemporary version, and they make the distinction between PTSD and complex PTSD. With complex PTSD, there are levels of trauma, usually from early history, childhood abuse, and then at other levels of trauma, which then complicate the whole picture. So, factors that influence how people might develop PTSD, there's personal history of the individual, there are demographic characteristics, there may be genetic factors, then the traumatic event itself, was it intentional or deliberate? You know, how intense was it? And then the recovery environment. When someone is traumatized, what kind of supportive environment do they go back to? Low social support and stressful life events can just lead to more trauma. Also related to PTSD and trauma, and you may have heard the term moral injury, and or spiritual struggle. And I'll read that to you. Moral injury is the distressing psychological, moral injury is a distressing psychological, behavioral, social, and sometimes spiritual aftermath of exposure to a traumatic or unusually stressful events in which the person may have perpetuated, failed to prevent, or witnessed events that contradict deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. Okay, it's when someone may do something against their belief system, or see others acting against their belief systems. And so you can see combat vets, as an example, are put in a place, a rock between a hard place. And you have to engage in behaviors that you wouldn't normally engage in regular life. Okay. And moral injury is related, there's a relationship with PTSD. And just some statistics in terms of the DSM-5 and PTSD. In the general population, in terms of lifetime, past 12 months and 6-month prevalence, It's about 8%, 5%, and 4% in the general population. And you can, as you can imagine, with our OEF, OIF combat veterans, PTSD is between like 15 to 20%, right? And also with PTSD, you're likely to have comorbidities. In other words, you'll have PTSD along with major depression. And in some instances, PTSD and TBI. And if you can see here, particularly with our combat vets in Afghanistan and Iraq, the exposure to blast and explosions, and that combined with the trauma of the event. So, going back to DSM-3, an event that is outside the range of usual human experience. Well, Laura Brown points out that, hey, wait, from a feminist perspective, wait a minute. The range of human experience becomes the range of what is normal and usual in the lives of men of the dominant class, white, young, able-bodied, educated, middle-class, Christian men. So she's saying, wait, there's more to that, to trauma. Trauma, there's trauma that occurs on a daily basis. You can think of harassment in the workplace, or you can think of sexual harassment in the workplace, particularly for women. That's can be a daily event, and it builds up over time. Think about being a young Black man walking down the street, and when police approach, what happens to them? Physically and emotionally, what's going on? And that happens constantly. So it builds. So she just shows that there are high base rate events that can be traumatic for folks, and to be aware of that. And that leads us to, one word for that is insidious trauma. That traumatic effects of oppression that are not necessarily overtly violent or threatening to the bodily well-being at a given moment, but that do violence to the soul and to the spirit and body over time. So, when we begin to think of trauma as an unusual event, that kind of causes us to say, it will never happen to me, that cloak of invulnerability. While if we begin to think of trauma as occurring more often, we can realize that, hey, I could be next, and we kind of lose that cloak. And people don't want to lose that cloak of vulnerability. So it's easier to kind of look at the extreme traumas than be aware of the other types of trauma. So here's another example of kind of insidious intergenerational trauma. And that's traumatic events experienced by one generation on subsequent generations. Lots of studies on survivors of the Holocaust, and it's a broad umbrella, and it can be as collective mass traumatic events that affect multiple generations or groups of people, and it impacts the families through time. And for example, in families of historical intergenerational trauma, there may be dysregulated communication, trauma impacted parenting, fear, distress, kind of chronic. And then what does that do to the offspring? And offspring wanting to escape or get away from their past, or a sense of heightened responsibility for the trauma that they may experience from their parents, I should say. So it has an impact. And then there's race-based trauma. And again, it's another term for an insidious type of trauma. And racial trauma or race-based traumatic stress refers to the mental and emotional injury caused by racial bias, racism, discrimination, and hate crimes. And any individual that has experienced or observed an emotional, painful, sudden, and or uncontrollable racist encounter is at risk. So not only victims, but those folks who witness that, it can be distressing to witness that. And I recall we were having a gathering of our medical department, Navy medical department at one of the restaurants downtown Portsmouth, Virginia. And we were all gathering there. And one gentleman who happened to be African-American was late because the police in Portsmouth, Virginia stopped him and asked him what he was doing. Okay. Merely because of the color of his skin. Okay. So, and this was in 2000. So it's continuous. And this gives some statistics in terms of race-based, historical, intergenerational, gender-based trauma. Native Americans report higher rates of stress and PTSD than any other racial group. In 2020, anti-Asian hate crimes spiked nearly 150%. Anti-Semitic incidents reached an all-time high in the United States in 2021, with a total of over close to 3,000 incidents. Intersectionality of race, ethnicity, and gender. The burdens of Black, Native, or Hispanic women, for example, contribute to a double load of discrimination, right? And the murder of George Floyd created a new level of anxiety and fatigue for Black and Brown communities. And a recent study found that Black adolescents face, on average, 5 racial discrimination encounters per day, all right? With the majority of these experiences occurring online, all right? So think about the impact of race-based trauma. It can foster helplessness, isolation, humiliation, depression, suicidal thinking, avoidance, and numbing. And it affects the non-BIPOC, the white non-BIPOC population, like me, right? And it can impact on me as I witness that. So think about trauma as a wide concept, and it's in a range. The part of trauma on the system, it impacts the human stress response, which is the fight or flight response, right? When there's danger around, part of the brain, the amygdala, starts saying danger, 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 and starts dumping chemicals in our system so that we can either run fast or fight hard. Okay. And it's an interesting series of events, processes, chemical processes. This gives a picture of that. I'm not going to go into this, but there's an interplay. The amygdala shouts danger, 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 and the prefrontal cortex is looking around to assess the situation, okay? Saying, is it dangerous or not? And when it assesses that it's not, it calms the amygdala down. But when you get really threatened and the chemicals dump, a lot of chemicals get dumped in, your prefrontal cortex goes out of whack. And so it's hard to assess the circumstances around it. If you're interested in this slide, I have a whole description of it in detail. You can also think about the physiological impact of trauma on your sympathetic and parasympathetic system. This is called the automatic ladder. Ventral vagal state is the state where you feel calm, you're able to interact with people, you're present focused, right? But when the fight or flight kicks in, the sympathetic system gets engaged and you're mobilized for action, fight or flight. But you can also, in a dorsal vagal state, you can end up feeling helpless and curling up in the corner in the fetal position. You freeze. And there are some therapies that help people traumatize clients to try to get back to that ventral vagal state and to be aware of it and to be aware of what can you do to bring yourself to that state. Because so often the traumatized person is in that sympathetic state constantly. And so, I mean, that's no way to live, right? So let's talk about the meaning of trauma. And Caruth, she's a professor of comparative literature, and she's written several books on trauma. And she talks about trauma, really the severe trauma that deals with death and loss. And that there are times that the trauma is such that we can't fully incorporate it at the moment it's happening. And because we can't incorporate it fully, it keeps coming back to haunt us. It comes back in bits and pieces over time. Hence, intrusive symptoms, right? Dreams and flashbacks and so on, or more details come in as time goes along. With some trauma, and you can think of genocide, you can think of repeated sexual abuse, it's confrontation with the almost unimaginable reality. How do you make sense of something that's unimaginable? And that's why it keeps floating around. The trauma keeps floating around and keeps coming back through time. It's hard to pinpoint the place of the trauma. It's a symptom of history. And so it's also bound up with the issue of truth, because if you don't know all the details of what happened, we don't know the truth of the event. So we try to think about, well, she suggests thinking about witnessing. When you witness to another person in their trauma, you're witnessing to something that may be impossible to fully understand. Dory Laub was a psychiatrist who interviewed survivors of the Holocaust. And he talks about trauma from that perspective. Again, like Caruth, he's saying the impossibility of telling a story of trauma, that the survivors of the Holocaust, of a Holocaust, usually keep it silent. And the more you keep it silent, the more it gets distorted, and the more you begin to blame yourself about the atrocity. And Dory Laub talks about the importance of witnessing to each other and having a testimony. Right? And he talks about some trauma. Just looking at my time here. He's talking about the severe trauma as an event without a witness. The traumatized has no one to witness it. And when you have no witness, you're alone, completely alone. And it becomes a secret that you can't divulge. And this happens today with combat veterans as well. And so he talks about witnessing as restoration. The listener becomes the trauma witness before the narrator. You can help somebody by witnessing. And that way, the truth can emerge through the telling of the story. And you can validate the person's experience. Those of you who may have experienced, let's say, harassment in the workplace, sometimes you may even think that you're the one that's crazy if you're experiencing day to day. But think about the extreme traumas and think about what that does internally in terms of what it means to the individual. He finally says in that quote, when you're dealing with trauma, it is the realization that the lost ones are not coming back, the realization that what life is all about is precisely living with an unfulfilled hope, only this time with a sense that you are not alone any longer, that someone can be there. There's no going back, there's no going back to before the trauma. the trauma impacts your life and changes your life. And how do you survive that? How do you deal with that? So I'm going to move now to Shelley Rambo, and she talks about trauma from a theological perspective and philosophical perspective. And trauma, at the top, that says trauma, death, and time. She looks at trauma in terms of its relationship to death and time. One moment, please. And so trauma can be understood as an encounter with death or a loss, and an event that shatters all that one knows about the world and all the familiar ways of operating in the world. And trauma becomes a defining event beyond which little can be conceived. There's no access to life as it was before the trauma. It's impossible to see life and death in any straightforward relationship. Think about what happened in Lewiston in less than a year ago, right? Think about its impact on us here and back, folks in Lewiston. And that's still with us. It's still reverberating. And it's an impossible story. Who would think, right, that something like that would happen in Lewiston? That was my hometown area. I grew up in Auburn, Lewiston. It's an impossible thing, and it happened. And realizing that we're not invulnerable to those things. And she talks about trauma leading to alterations in time, body, and word. Remember, I talked about the clusters of symptoms of PTSD, right? So it alters our sense of time, it alters our body, it alters the way we think about the world and ourselves. And so the question is, what remains in the aftermath of death and loss? She talks about remaining. That's the central question of trauma. What remains after the traumatic death and loss? She talks about time, trauma and time. In our culture, we are seduced by linear time, going from A to B in a straight line. And we want to really go, as this picture shows, we want to go from the trauma to complete healing. We want to see the healing as quickly as possible. We don't have patience with what's in the middle between what happened here and what happened in the next picture. Okay. So she says we're uneasy with trauma, we're impatient with suffering, and we want to push beyond it. See, and you hear this from trauma folks. I want to be the person I was before. My spouse wants me to be the person I was before. We want that so badly, but that can't be. That can't be. So she talks about we can talk about three types of time: the linear time, cyclical time, but then there's helical time. Cyclical time is when you get caught in a loop, over and over again. You're reliving the trauma, or you keep doing the same thing. An obsessive compulsive disorder, that's cyclical time. You keep getting caught in a loop. Linear time is what we're used to in our work environments: production and moving quickly, making sure the sermon doesn't last too long, right? But that's linear time. But she talks about helical time. You remember the Slinkies? Yeah, right. That's what helical time is. You go back to the trauma or the events in your life. You remember those, but you move forward in time because you're integrating it. All right. Linear time, as I said, impatience with suffering. We're seduced by it. It's part of our culture. And cyclical time is life as it was, and it cannot be retrieved. When you start hearing about people wanting to go back to the golden age, we should go back. That's cyclical time. It ain't gonna happen. Okay? It ain't gonna happen. What's helical time? Each moment in process recapitulates its history and yet adds its own fresh becoming. Its flow is neither linear nor circular, but helical, being oriented to the past in such a way that it is recognized for what it is and yet transformed. Death remains in the experience of survival, and life is reshaped in light of death. There's a mixed relationship between life and death. It's the middle territory. The middle territory. As I've said, the central to trauma is an encounter with death and loss, and the remainder and the persistence of death in life. So, one question is the trauma the encounter with death or the ongoing experience of having survived it? See, there's two aspects of trauma, right? The trauma itself, and then the trauma of living after it. Here's a quote from a combat veteran at Fallujah. Out there, the boundary between life and death shrank so much that it was little more than a membrane, thin and clear, with hardly a step. You could pass from life into death, and sometimes it seemed from death back to life. And this was also said by Caron, that the challenge of trauma is the challenge of witnessing to a phenomena that exceeds the categories by which we make sense of the world. Think about an 18-year-old ending up in Vietnam. From Maine, a Mainer going to Vietnam. It's a whole, I mean, their whole world would just, shatter. So, witnessing is being in the middle ground where life and death cannot be read apart from each other. And as I mentioned before, listen to two crisis stories, the unbearable nature of the event, and then the unbearable nature of surviving. That's the two-sided aspect of trauma. So, taking into account concepts of trauma, definitions of trauma, and the impact of trauma on ourselves, our mind, body, and spirits, right? Shelley Rambo says, let's look at the cross resurrection redemption narrative from this lens of trauma. Not looking at the events of Jesus' cross and resurrection from the perspective of Easter Sunday. Easter Sunday joy, right? All these triumphal hymns and this loud music, and which I like to do, I like to play that, right? But all that triumphalism really is not, I think, a true reflection of the cross resurrection redemption event. It's looking at these events from the point of view of the disciples on Saturday. Look at it from Saturday, from the middle ground, from those who remained after Jesus' death. What was it like? Who suffered more, Jesus or his mother, who was witnessing what's happening to him? All right? Think of Mary Magdalene and the disciples, and even the disciples who ran away. The guilt, can you imagine the guilt and the shame for them, right? So, looking at that from the viewpoint of trauma. See, the grand narrative, redemptive narrative, events are often interpreted as the climax of a grand redemptive narrative. The redemptive narrative of cross and resurrection is often read in a linear fashion, okay, linear time, right? linear fashion in which life, resurrection, is victorious over death, a linear reading of life over and against death, death and life at opposite poles, and death is concluded and new life is ushered in. Hallelujah. Right? Right? That's the grand narrative, redemptive narrative. See, we want to go from death cross to life resurrection as quickly as possible. Traumatic experience, insofar as it reconfigures the relationship between death and life, challenges familiar interpretations of redemption. With trauma, death is not something concluded, and life is not a fresh start and new beginning. It's the middle ground, right? Death and life, this middle ground. What was it like for Jesus's mother, Mary Magdalene, the beloved disciple who witnessed the crucifixion? What was it like for the other disciples who fled? What was it like for Jesus' friends, disciples on the day after his death? Exactly what did they experience during their encounter with the risen Jesus? All right. I'd like to ask someone to help me who can read real nice and loud. Be willing to read something. You could read what's in yellow, nice and loud, and slowly. And I'm going to pantomime what you're reading. Okay? Yeah.
Want me to start?
Yes.
Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the tomb.
Go ahead.
But Mary stood weeping outside the tomb. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb, and she saw two angels in white, sitting where the body of Jesus had been lying, one at the head and the other at the feet. They said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" She said to them, "They have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." When she had said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you looking for?" Supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned and said to him in Hebrew, "Rabbinu," which means teacher. Jesus said to her, "Do not hold on to me, because I have not yet ascended to the Father. But go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene went and announced to the disciples, "I have seen the Lord."
Thank you. Thank you, Barbara. Okay. Did you notice anything?
You didn't go anywhere, you did nothing.
Well, okay. That's right. No. Did you notice my turning? Okay, okay. I went to the tomb. Write that down.
Right.
And what did I do? What did it say? Mary turned around. Right? But then she turned around again. Shelley Rambo points to the fact that she turns. Why would, if she's talking to Jesus here, and he says Mary, and she turns over here? Okay, that has to do, she interprets it as a problem of, it's a displacement. not really able to locate where Jesus is,
How do you know she turned?
because it said so in the. It's in scripture. Yeah, so there's a series of obstructions here in this story. One, it's dark outside. Mary Magdalene is weeping throughout the whole scene. And she partially looks into the tomb. The Greek word that is used, parakupto, to look from outside through a low entrance, or also implies a quick, fleeting, stolen look. She repeatedly recounts Jesus's absence. I left out part of the text just for the sake of time here, but 3 times she says, "Where, so they've taken Jesus away. Where's his body?" 3 times she mentions that. Also, other senses are altered. Turn and turn. See, she turns around and sees Jesus. Then she hears her name called from back here, and she turns. Okay, so it's hard for her to locate. She's speaking face to face to him at one point without recognition. Right? So what exactly is Mary encountering, and what constitutes her witness? Remember, she's traumatized and she's experiencing something, but in a new way. See, the voice from behind calls her name, a moment of recognition, yet the distance is introduced. See, when she uses the term Rabboni, that's a diminutive term of endearment, but a title nonetheless. It's still a title. Why didn't she say Jesus? And Jesus' statements, "Do not touch me, I have not yet ascended to the Father." That's another distance, right? So there's distance there. So the risen Jesus is in her present, yet so distant, she can't recognize him. She can't locate him. And Mary cannot fully locate him. The unseeing and tangles of translation make it impossible to understand Mary's witness as straightforward and direct, right? When many times folks think of the resurrection experiences as a real direct experience. Remember that Jesus appeared in as a resurrected form to his disciples. He didn't show up at the Citadel, walking up the steps and saying, "I'm back," right? It was the disciples who had that resurrection experience. There was something there about relationship. What does the account of Mary Magdalene tell us about what it means to witness? Mary's witness is dominated by unseeing. It's not direct, it's not clear, or easy. The text dismantles sound and even touch as vehicles constituting Mary's witness. Her witness reflects the complexities of seeing in the aftermath of death and loss. It's very complex to see life after the trauma, right? Which happens to traumatized individuals. It's hard for them to see a future for themselves. It's hard for them to envision the future. Mary's witness, it's an unusual orchestration of the senses, or what we might call a sensorium surrounding her witness. She points to a different kind of presence whose form cannot be readily identified or can only be received through multiple experiences and misrecognitions. She encounters not simply the absence of Jesus, but a mixed terrain of his absence and his presence. He's there, but not there. He's present in a way that she has not known before. It goes beyond our ability, the resurrection goes beyond our ability for our language to capture fully. So she talks about, call them tools, but suggestions from Jesus given to his disciples when he was talking directly to them before his death. This one statement from Jesus, as the Father has loved me, so I have loved you, abide in my love. She translates the word for abide as remain, because I think it's I don't know if it's the Aramaic or the Greek word, but it means to dwell, to abide, to remain, which is a relational term. So to remain is to be one who survives Jesus and the horrifying events of the cross. And Jesus tells the disciples that they will be survivors of his death. And the power to remain is made possible through the gift of the Paraclete. And he's saying to them, abide in my love. So there's some key there. I don't have an answer to this, but there's some key to the resurrection experience and remaining in the love of Jesus that he had given to them while he was amongst them. So remaining in love conveys a link to witnessing life reshaped through death. So reading Shelley Rambo and my work with trauma, these are some of my questions, reflection questions. You know, how aware am I of common shock and trauma in my own life? How aware am I? How aware am I of witnessing trauma in my own life? How empathetic am I to others' trauma and survival experiences? How do we witness to our own tombs, our own traumas, our own losses? How do we witness and accompany others to their tombs and their traumas and their losses? And I add those, how do we accompany each other? Because that's what part of being in a community is about, isn't it? Christian community. Am I seduced by linear time? Do I have the patience to remain in the middle, witnessing to trauma and new life emerging from the trauma? Helical time. How often do we rush to Easter Sunday? How often do we avoid or gloss over the trauma and rush straight ahead to a quick fix or get back to normal, this desire to get back to normal? How well do we acknowledge the losses, the support? How well do we acknowledge the losses, support the mourning, and provide testimony to the survival from trauma? How well do we sustain compassion for each other, remain with each other, and travel together to make sense of our unique and shared traumas? If we do take that journey, is it possible that we may experience more deeply the mystery of Jesus' cross and resurrection? I think it's possible. I don't know what that experience will be like for you. So one thing about, our Christian tradition, particularly our liturgical tradition, is our Eucharistic feast, our Eucharistic worship, because that helps us get into helical time. We're always saying, we remember how you loved us till your death, and you're with us here, and you will come back in glory. Okay, that's the remembrance part, right? But we also come together, bringing our prayers, the present, and the person who provides the sermon is providing a integration of what's going on now and what went on then within the community. And so we're reforming, transforming the death and resurrection of Jesus by coming together in that Eucharistic celebration. That's one way. So, comments, questions? I got through a lot.
Sounds like we don't spend enough time on Holy Saturday. We don't spend enough time for what must have been happening.
Yeah.
I don't think we spend that kind of time with one another. There are experiences of sharing trauma that is not happy for the sharer. People are not always able to be with someone who suffered the trauma. Like, get over it,
Right.
Yeah. Going back to your PTSD among soldiers, whatever, to your personal.
Yeah.
Going back to your comments about PTSD among soldiers and other traumatic things. I'm a part of an organization called Maine Pause for Veterans.
Oh, yeah.
They're trained service dogs to work with vets who have PTSD.
Mhm.
And they do an incredible job.
Mhm.
And these veterans, are witness, they witness and they find stuff like they
Mhm.
go through.
Mhm.
And it's a very difficult procedure to balance the dogs and train the dogs and get the people, the men with the dog and women with the dogs, and then integrate into the family and integrate with society. And it's a really successful program.
Mhm.
There's a tremendous amount of good for these veterans.
Yeah. Yeah, it is a great program. They do training in Brunswick, I believe. No, is it?
Their headquarters are in
Right,
Brunswick.
yeah. Yeah, but think about that. Why dogs, right? Dogs are really good at getting us to that state of being present-centered and calm, usually. Yeah, yeah. But that to be present-focused, right? It helps the system. Hence why it's so effective with people who suffer from.
It takes a long time for them both to be focused on each other.
That's right, yeah. Yeah.
Be sensitive to each other.
Right, right.
Greg, just a quickie.
Mhm.
It occurred to me when I read the title of your talk, that you associated the trauma with the resurrection, okay? I immediately thought of Christ on the cross,
Mhm.
and had he been taken down before he died, he certainly would have gone to some place where his trauma would have been treated. So there's a physical sort of meaning to this. I think that medical people use trauma centers, for example.
Mhm.
And it's interesting that you associate physical damage with trauma or only psychological.
Oh, it's related. It's
One
related,
you
yeah.
could say the trauma created the trauma.
Well, there's the trauma of where your life is threatened, right? In your physical integrity is damaged, right? It's threatening of your life. Well, you are experiencing physical and psychological trauma at the same time. Right, right. See, in fact, the treatment of combat vets across the United States in the DoD and the VA, particularly for veterans coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq, there's 3 elements that we have to address. It's the psychological trauma with a TBI, as well as with the physical chronic pain. So you have veterans who they've had TBI and their cognitive processes are slowed down. They have chronic pain, and then they have the anxiety and depression from the PTSD.
Thanks.
Yeah.
TBI is traumatic brain
Yeah,
injury.
yes, I'm sorry, yeah, thanks. Traumatic brain injury, concussion. And various levels of severity with that.
I very much appreciated your presentation. Thank you.
No, thank you.
Can you speak to the effect of men and women in a circle of people that they have a shared experience with? Like I'm thinking of the common experience of people in recovery that has been so successful, that people have the opportunities to share their story. They become integrated into the culture and the loop of maybe normalcy and moving forward through time, like that kill of time.
Mhm.
What's your experience with combat vets in that similar experience?
Well, in a group setting, you're saying? Yes, I mean, that is really important because they're encouraging one another to not only share what they experience, but also helping each other in the current day. You know, what's going on during their week and helping one another in that way as well. So the groups that I facilitate, it's not so much focusing on details of what happened to them, although it might happen, but it's usually, you know, a way of supporting one another.
And what's the relationship that, I imagine you've studied the relationship of the efficacy of that moray of group
Mhm.
versus the traditional Western psychiatric approach?
When you say are you talking about medication or both? Yeah,
From the community storytelling type of influence.
uh-huh. Well, certainly groups have been shown to be effective, but there are some other individual treatments now that have shown to be really effective, which are cognitive processing therapy, which looks at the way the trauma impacts the way you think. And we look at the way the person is thinking and look at different perspectives, which then can make some changes in their emotions and quality of life. Or exposure therapy, which that's a little bit more intense in terms of recounting the trauma event and recircuiting the event in the mind, and then lowering the anxiety in settings that typically cause anxiety. For example, you'll hear veterans talk about, well, when I go to a public place, I sit with my back to the wall, right? I need to see everything. And so getting an exposure experiment would be, why don't you sit with your back, facing your spouse, and try that for a bit. So.
Wait, I was gonna say we have time for probably one more question. Jeff?
I am curious when I think about the introvert extrovert scale. Is there typically a difference in the way introverts or extroverts experience and then react to trauma, or the way they deal with it afterwards?
Well, that's an interesting question. I haven't really studied that, but certainly in treatment, we look at a person's personality style, right? Because their personality style will impact the way they not only experience the trauma, but how they try to manage with it. It's all, we're all one being with all of those characters. Oh, one more? Okay.
Quick question. A couple of times you mentioned particular trauma from soldiers, particularly people who served in Afghanistan. Is there a qualitative difference between that trauma and what the soldiers who served in Vietnam?
Oh, certainly.
And
Yeah.
how do we account for that? What is that different, or are they just throwing out all?
Well, think about the way the soldiers from Vietnam were not welcomed back, I should say, into the US. When they were on their way back, they were told not to wear their uniform or throw their uniform away, right? And think about when we come back from Afghanistan, when you fly into the Baltimore airport, you've got people greeting you. Your heroes, right? It's a very different experience. And the fight in Vietnam was getting really crazy at one point, because they were using, when you go to war, you have certain metrics you're looking at. What makes it successful? And you're looking for centers of gravity to kind of lower the ability of the enemy to fight back. Well, Vietnam War, the metric was changed to body count, right? What does that do? That's not what, that's not what we are trained for, but that's what the metric was. So it just changes the, anyway.
Thank you, Greg. for this.
Thank you.
Our next forum is August 4th, and we happen to have our presenter here among us. If you would welcome Carolyn Eklund, and maybe she could say a word about our next forum.
I love this so much, and I'm so glad, we've been hearing about this at Good Shepherd Lutheran for 2 weeks now, because our pastor's been sharing the forum. Next week, or in 2 weeks, I'll be talking about, homelessness and, some of the factors in our area that are affecting homelessness. Maine Housing keeps track of it, nationally we keep track of it, but also what is our attitude toward homelessness? And I loved your scripture references and art. So we'll be looking at, art in the Good Samaritan.
So same time, same place, 2 weeks. And thanks again, Greg. That was very neat. Thanks to Bob and Judy Mansfield for making sure we were well fed. If you could help them tidy up, many hands make light work.
Wondering about the relationship
Catch you for this.
Sure.
between trauma and grief. Grief is gonna be a big part of this.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. It's part of that.
Yeah.
How do you grieve?